Sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest courage. When 6-year-old Evangeline Hartwell found herself lost in the Arizona desert in 1876, she had no idea that her next decision would echo through history. Wandering with only a half-empty canteen, she discovered a dying Apache warrior beneath the desert's sun. Despite everything she'd been taught about danger, her heart told her something different. She knelt down and shared her water, the only thing keeping her alive in that unforgiving land. As the warrior closed his eyes, little Evangeline had no idea she was being watched from the canyon walls. How could one act of kindness bring 700 Apache warriors to her family's doorstep at dawn? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory of 1876 was a land that tested the souls of those brave enough, or foolish enough, to call it home. Where the Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, only the hardiest could survive the scorching days and bone-chilling nights. It was here, in this wilderness that seemed forsaken by God himself, that Thomas Hartwell had chosen to build his family's future. The Hartwell homestead sat like a small island of hope in an ocean of red sand and thorny mesquite. Thomas had constructed their cabin with his own calloused hands, each beam carefully shaped with the carpenter's tools he'd carried west from Missouri. The structure wasn't grand, just 4 sturdy walls, a peaked roof, and a covered porch that provided blessed shade during the brutal afternoon hours. But it was solid, built to last through desert storms and the occasional Apache raid that had claimed other settlers in the territory. Thomas was a man of quiet faith and steady hands, his weathered face bearing the lines of someone who'd learned to read both the desert's moods and the weight of responsibility. At 42, his brown hair showed threads of premature silver, earned through nights spent listening for the sound of unshod horses or the whisper of arrows in flight. He'd been a carpenter back in Missouri, crafting fine furniture for the prosperous families of St. Louis. But the call of land ownership and the promise of a new beginning had drawn him west after the war ended. The small wooden cross he'd carved for their mantelpiece served as both decoration and daily reminder of the faith that sustained his family through the hardships. Sarah Hartwell possessed the quiet strength that frontier life demanded of women. Once a schoolteacher in a civilized Missouri town, she now spent her days managing their precious water supply, tending their small vegetable garden, and teaching their daughter the lessons that would keep her alive in this unforgiving land. Her auburn hair, usually pinned back in a practical bun, caught the desert light in ways that still made Thomas's heart skip after 12 years of marriage. She'd given up much to follow her husband west: the comfort of neighbors, the security of established society, the simple pleasure of walking to a real school each morning, but she'd never spoken a word of complaint. Their daughter Evangeline was the light that made all their sacrifices worthwhile. At 6 years old, she possessed an unusual combination of her father's thoughtful nature and her mother's gentle compassion, mixed with a curiosity that sometimes worried her parents. Unlike other children who might have been hardened by frontier life, Evangeline seemed to absorb the desert's beauty rather than its harshness. She had a way with injured creatures, nursing wounded rabbits back to health and coaxing frightened birds to eat from her small hands. Her blonde hair gleamed like spun gold in the desert sun, and her blue eyes held a depth that seemed older than her years. The family's daily routine revolved around the precious rhythms of desert survival. Each morning began before dawn, when the air still carried the desert's nighttime coolness. Thomas would check their small herd of cattle and horses, while Sarah prepared breakfast over their wood-burning stove. Evangeline's job was feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, a task she approached with the seriousness of a much older child. She understood, even at 6, that every egg meant the difference between a full belly and going hungry. Water dominated every decision in their lives. The well Thomas had dug yielded enough for their basic needs, but conservation was a constant concern. Every drop was precious, every use carefully considered. Bathing happened once a week, laundry even less frequently. The sight of Evangeline sharing her water would have horrified any frontier family. Water was life itself, not something to be given away lightly. The desert around their homestead told stories of violence and survival. Bleached bones scattered near dried creek beds spoke of cattle that had wandered too far from water. Abandoned wagons, stripped of everything useful, marked the graves of dreams that had died in the sand. Apache signs appeared regularly, bent branches, disturbed rocks, tracks that vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared. The indigenous people of this land moved like ghosts through territory they'd claimed for generations, watching the newcomers with eyes that missed nothing. Relations between settlers and Apaches had grown increasingly tense over the past months. 3 families had already abandoned their homesteads after finding arrows embedded in their cabin walls. The Hendersons, who'd lived just 5 miles east, had disappeared entirely one night, leaving behind only scattered belongings and bloodstains that told a story no one wanted to read completely. Fear permeated every conversation among the scattered settler community, turning neighbors into suspicious strangers who looked at shadows differently than they had just a year before. Yet Thomas had noticed something others missed in their fear-driven observations. The Apache signs around their property seemed different somehow, not threatening, but watchful. Rocks arranged in patterns that felt more like markers than warnings. Tracks that circled their homestead but never approached close enough to suggest hostile intent. He'd mentioned this to Sarah late one night, whispering his observations as Evangeline slept in her small bed across their one-room cabin. "Perhaps they're just curious," Sarah had whispered back, her voice carrying hope she didn't quite believe herself. The other settler families in their scattered community represented the full spectrum of frontier humanity. There was Jeremiah Banks, whose ranch sprawled across 1,000 acres of prime grazing land and who'd made his fortune trading horses with the cavalry stationed at Fort Apache. Banks was a hard man who believed the only good Apache was a dead Apache, and he'd convinced several other families that peaceful coexistence was impossible. His influence grew stronger with each reported raid, each family that packed up and fled back east. Then there was Martha Caldwell, the widow who'd stayed on her late husband's property despite everyone's advice to return to civilization. She ran a small trading post where settlers could buy supplies and hear news from the outside world. Martha had learned to speak some Apache during her husband's lifetime. He'd been more tolerant than most, and she often served as an informal mediator when tensions rose between the communities. Her weathered hands and kind eyes had seen enough of frontier life to understand that survival sometimes required flexibility rather than rigid thinking. The Mexican trader Carlos Mendoza passed through their area every few months, his pack mules loaded with goods from both sides of the border. Carlos spoke multiple languages and moved freely between Apache, Mexican, and American communities. He brought news, supplies, and most importantly, perspective from someone who understood all the peoples trying to share this harsh land. Thomas had grown to trust Carlos's judgment about Apache intentions, finding the trader's observations more reliable than the fear-driven rumors that spread among other settlers. Evangeline had always been drawn to Carlos during his visits, fascinated by his stories of different peoples and customs. She would sit quietly while he spoke with her parents, absorbing tales of Apache ceremonies and Mexican festivals with equal interest. Sarah worried sometimes about her daughter's open acceptance of unfamiliar cultures, knowing that such attitudes could be dangerous in their current circumstances. The child's compassionate nature had manifested in countless small ways throughout her short life. She'd once insisted on keeping a wounded coyote pup in their cabin until it healed, despite her father's protests about the danger. She shared her food with stray cats and spoke to their horses as if they understood every word. Thomas had found her more than once sitting beside graves in their small family cemetery, telling stories to the wooden crosses that marked settlers who hadn't survived their first desert winter. "She has too tender a heart for this place," Sarah would sometimes say. watching Evangeline care for another injured creature, but Thomas saw something different in his daughter's kindness. In the land that seemed designed to harden hearts and narrow minds, Evangeline's compassion felt like a form of resistance against the desert's brutal indifference. Her ability to see past fear to the person or creature needing help struck him as a kind of wisdom that adults often lost in their rush to survive. The evening before everything changed, the family had gathered around their small wooden table for supper and evening prayers. Thomas had carved that table during their first winter, working by lamplight after his daily chores were finished. Sarah had prepared rabbit stew and cornbread, a feast by their modest standards, and Evangeline had contributed eggs from her beloved chickens. As they held hands around the table, Thomas offered their customary prayer of gratitude. Lord, we thank you for this food, for our health, and for keeping us safe in this wilderness. Help us to be good neighbors to all people, and grant us wisdom to know right from wrong in difficult times. Evangeline had squeezed her parents' hands extra tight that evening, though none of them understood why at the time. Later they would remember that moment as the last ordinary evening of their old life, before a child's simple act of mercy changed everything they thought they knew about their place in the desert. The wooden cross on their mantelpiece caught the lamplight as they finished their meal, its simple form casting long shadows across their cabin walls. Thomas had carved it during their first difficult winter, when food was scarce and their future uncertain. Now it served as both decoration and daily reminder of the faith that had carried them through every hardship. Outside their windows, the desert night settled over the landscape with its familiar symphony of coyote calls and shifting wind. Stars blazed overhead in the clear, dry air, the same stars that had guided other families to this place and would continue shining long after their small human struggles were forgotten. None of them could have imagined that by the next sunset, those same stars would be witnessing the beginning of something that would be remembered for generations. Dawn came early to the Arizona territory, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold that lasted only minutes before the sun's harsh reality took hold. Sarah Hartwell was already awake, as frontier wives learned to be, preparing coffee over their wood stove, when she noticed the chicken coop gate standing wide open. "Thomas," she called softly, not wanting to wake Evangeline. "Henrietta's gotten loose again." That red hen had been escaping regularly for the past week, somehow working the latch loose despite Thomas's repeated repairs. She was their best layer, which made her wandering particularly troublesome. Thomas pulled on his boots and hat, grabbing his rifle more from habit than any specific concern. "I'll find her," he muttered, stepping into the cool morning air. But Evangeline had already heard the commotion from her small bed. At 6 years old, she possessed the quick hearing that children develop in quiet places, and Henrietta was her special favorite among their small flock. She'd named all the chickens and could identify each one by the sound of their individual clucks and calls. While her parents searched the immediate area around their homestead, Evangeline slipped out the back door in her nightgown and bare feet. She could hear Henrietta's distinctive scolding somewhere beyond the garden fence, deeper into the desert than the hen usually wandered. The little girl grabbed her small tin canteen from its hook by the door, a habit her mother had drilled into her. Since she could walk and followed the sound, the morning air felt wonderfully cool against her skin after the stifling heat they'd endured all week. Evangeline loved this time of day, when the desert seemed peaceful and welcoming rather than hostile. She could see clearly in the growing light, following what appeared to be Henrietta's scratched tracks in the sandy soil. "Here, Henrietta," she called softly, using the gentle voice that usually brought the hen running. "Come back home." But the tracks led further than she'd expected, past the familiar landmarks of their property and into the maze of red rock canyons that marked the beginning of truly wild country. Evangeline had been taught never to venture into those canyons alone, but Henrietta's calls seemed to come from just beyond the next bend, always just out of sight. The sun climbed higher as she followed the winding canyon path, and the cool morning air began warming rapidly. Her nightgown caught on thorny bushes, and sharp rocks hurt her bare feet, but she could still hear what sounded like her chickens somewhere ahead. The walls of the canyon rose higher around her, blocking out more of the sky and creating deeper shadows that would have frightened a less determined child. It was nearly noon when Evangeline finally admitted to herself that she was completely lost. The canyon had branched several times, and she could no longer remember which path she'd taken. Worse, she couldn't hear Henrietta anymore, hadn't heard her for some time. Though she'd been too focused on the search to notice when the calls stopped, the sun beat down mercilessly now, turning the canyon into a furnace of reflected heat. Evangeline's nightgown stuck to her small body with sweat, and her throat felt dry and scratchy. She unscrewed the cap of her precious canteen and allowed herself one small sip of the warm water inside. Remembering her mother's lessons about conservation, she was trying to decide which canyon path might lead home when she heard something that definitely wasn't a chicken, a low, pained sound that seemed to come from the rocks above. Following the sound, she climbed carefully up a narrow ledge and discovered a sight that stopped her heart. An Apache warrior lay sprawled among the red rocks, his dark skin slicked with sweat and blood. 3 arrow shafts protruded from his chest and shoulder, their fletching bright against his torn shirt. His breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that spoke of a man very close to death. War paint covered his face, red ochre mixed with what looked like sacred symbols, and his long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers that stirred slightly in the canyon breeze. Every lesson her parents had taught her about Apache dangers flooded through Evangeline's mind at once. These were the people who raided homesteads and killed families. These were the savages her father locked their doors against each night. This wounded man represented everything she'd been taught to fear about their dangerous new home. But as she stared down at him, all she could see was someone who was hurt and dying. His eyes, when they fluttered open and met hers, held no violence or hatred, only pain and resignation. He was older than her father, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent reading the desert's moods and seasons. His hands, though large and calloused from a warrior's life, were relaxed and empty of weapons. The warrior's lips moved slightly, and a sound emerged that might have been words in a language she didn't understand. His gaze fixed on her small canteen with an expression of desperate thirst. In the growing heat of midday, she could imagine how long he'd been lying there without water, his body slowly surrendering to the desert's merciless demands. Evangeline stood frozen for long moments, caught between everything she'd been taught and something deeper that her young heart recognized. This man was someone's father, someone's son. He had people who would grieve his loss, just as she would grieve if her own father lay dying under the sun. Moving slowly, she climbed down to where the warrior lay. He watched her approach with eyes that held no threat, only a kind of wonder at this small, blonde child who seemed to have materialized from the canyon walls like a desert spirit. When she knelt beside him, he made no move to grab her or cause harm. Instead, Evangeline unscrewed her canteen cap and carefully lifted the warrior's head, supporting it with her small hand while she brought the water to his cracked lips. He drank gratefully, and she could see the relief in his eyes as the precious liquid eased his suffering. She gave him nearly half of her remaining water, keeping only enough for her own survival in the desert heat. As she helped him drink, the warrior's eyes never left her face. He seemed to be studying her features, memorizing them with the intensity of someone who understood this might be his last clear moment of consciousness. His lips moved again, and this time she caught what sounded like "thank you" in English, though spoken with an accent that made the words sound like a prayer. When he could drink no more, Evangeline gently lowered his head back to the rocks. The warrior's breathing had eased somewhat, though she could see that her water had only delayed the inevitable. His eyes began to drift closed, but not before he lifted one trembling hand to touch her cheek, in a gesture that was unmistakably a blessing. That touch changed something fundamental in Evangeline's understanding of the world. This dying man, this supposed enemy of her people, had blessed her with the tenderness of a grandfather. In that moment, all the fear-driven lessons about Apache savagery crumbled before the simple reality of shared humanity. She sat with him as his breathing gradually slowed, a small hand resting on his arm in the only comfort she could offer. When she was certain he had passed from consciousness into whatever dreams might come before death, she carefully stood and began trying to find her way home. What Evangeline didn't know, couldn't have known, was that their entire encounter had been witnessed from the canyon walls above. Apache scouts, drawn by the sound of their dying war chief's final breaths, had watched in amazement as a small settler child offered water and comfort to Stone Bear, one of their most respected leaders. The scouts had followed her progress through the canyons, ready to rescue their chief from what they'd assumed would be another act of settler violence. Instead, they witnessed something none of them had thought possible. Mercy offered freely from one people to another, with no expectation of reward or recognition. As Evangeline stumbled through the desert heat toward home, the Apache scouts sent runners racing toward their main camp. The story they carried would need to be told to their chief, their medicine men, their wisest elders. A child of the people who had driven them from their ancestral lands had just honored their dying war leader with the most precious gift imaginable in the desert, water, given from her own need. By the time Evangeline finally saw the familiar outline of her family's homestead shimmering in the afternoon heat, runners were already spreading word of her deed throughout Apache territory. The consequences of her simple act of kindness had begun to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that would reshape the destiny of everyone in the territory. Her parents spotted her from a distance and came running, their relief and terror mixing in equal measure as they swept her into their arms and carried her toward the safety of home. The reunion between Evangeline and her frantic parents played out in their dusty front yard as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Thomas reached her first, scooping his daughter into his arms with hands that shook from hours of mounting terror. Sarah arrived moments behind him, tears streaming down her sun-weathered cheeks as she pressed her palms against Evangeline's flushed face, checking for injuries or signs of heat sickness. "Sweet Lord, child, where have you been?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with relief and remaining fear. "We've been searching everywhere. The whole settlement's been looking for you." Evangeline, exhausted from her desert ordeal and overwhelmed by her parents' emotion, could barely speak through her dry throat. Thomas carried her immediately to their water barrel on the covered porch, where Sarah held a ladle of precious water to their daughter's lips. Only after she'd drunk deeply did the words begin tumbling out of her in a rush. "I found Henrietta's tracks, but then I got lost in the canyons. And there was a man, an Apache man, and he was hurt real bad with arrows, and he was so thirsty, Papa. So I gave him some of my water because he was dying and—" "Stop!" Thomas commanded, his voice sharp with alarm. "What did you say about an Apache?" The fear that had just begun to leave his eyes came flooding back as Evangeline's story poured forth. She described the wounded warrior in detail, his war paint, the eagle feathers in his hair, the arrows in his chest, and most shocking of all, her decision to share her water with him. With each detail, her parents' expressions grew more horrified. "Evangeline Marie Hartwell," Sarah said, using her daughter's full name in the tone that meant serious trouble. "Do you understand what you've done? You gave our water, our precious water, to a savage who might have killed you the moment he had strength." But Evangeline shook her head emphatically. "He wasn't savage, Mama. He was hurt and scared, just like when I found that baby owl with the broken wing. His eyes were sad, not mean. And when I helped him drink, he touched my face real gentle, like Grandpa used to do." Thomas felt his world shifting beneath his feet. His 6-year-old daughter had done the unthinkable, made direct contact with Apache warriors, and lived to tell about it. But more than that, she'd shown them mercy, which could be interpreted as either weakness to exploit or strength to respect. In Apache culture, such gestures carried weight that most settlers never understood. By evening, word of Evangeline's disappearance and safe return had spread throughout their scattered community. Neighbors began arriving at the Hartwell homestead, some to offer relief at the child's safety, others to hear details of her encounter with the Apache warrior. The small cabin filled with voices as familiar faces gathered around their wooden table. Jeremiah Banks arrived with 3 other men from his ranch, all of them armed and wearing expressions of grim determination. Banks was a large man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier violence to believe in peaceful solutions. He'd lost a brother to Apache raids 5 years earlier and had never forgotten the lesson that mercy toward enemies was a luxury that got families killed. "Thomas," Banks said, without preamble, "we need to talk about what your girl saw out there. If there's wounded Apaches this close to our homes, it means there's been fighting nearby. Could be they're planning something bigger." Martha Caldwell had also come, bringing with her the calm perspective that came from years of frontier experience. The widow woman sat beside Sarah, offering wordless comfort, while the men debated the implications of Evangeline's story. Martha had learned to read the signs that others missed, and something about this situation felt different from the usual pattern of Apache raids. "Wait," Martha said quietly, interrupting Banks's speculation about impending attacks. "Let the child tell her story properly. Evangeline, this warrior you found, describe his paint and feathers again." Evangeline, still tired but beginning to recover her strength, repeated her description of the dying man. She spoke of the red ochre paint mixed with symbols she didn't recognize, the eagle feathers arranged in a specific pattern, and the way he'd worn them with obvious pride despite his wounds. Martha's weathered face grew thoughtful. She'd learned enough Apache customs from her late husband to recognize that Evangeline's description matched that of a war chief or respected leader, not a common raider. The specific arrangement of eagle feathers and the sacred paint patterns suggested someone of high standing in their community. "Thomas," Martha said carefully, "I think your daughter might have helped someone very important to them. What she's describing sounds like ceremonial dress, not war paint for a raid. But Banks wouldn't be swayed by such distinctions. Important or not, he's Apache, and he was armed and on our land. The only good— He wasn't armed," Evangeline interrupted, her small voice cutting through Banks's familiar refrain. "He didn't have any weapons at all. Just the arrows that were stuck in him, and they weren't his arrows because they had different feathers." This detail stopped the conversation entirely. If the warrior had been shot with arrows that weren't his own, it suggested he'd been fleeing from something or someone, not preparing to attack settlers. The implications shifted the entire nature of the encounter, from threatening to potentially tragic. Thomas sat quietly through these discussions, watching his daughter's face as she answered each question with the straightforward honesty that marked her character. She showed no fear of the wounded warrior, no sense that she'd done anything wrong in helping him. If anything, she seemed puzzled by the adult's alarm at her act of simple kindness. That night, after their neighbors had finally departed and Evangeline was asleep in her small bed, Thomas and Sarah sat on their porch in the cooling desert air. The stars blazed overhead with desert clarity, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other across the emptiness. "She could have been killed," Sarah whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her since hearing the full story. "But she wasn't," Thomas replied, though his own hands still trembled slightly when he thought about how differently the encounter might have ended. "And what she did, Sarah, I've never heard of a child her age making that kind of choice. She saw someone suffering and helped them, despite everything we've taught her about danger." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the day's events, but their deeper implications. Finally, she spoke the fear that neither of them had yet voiced aloud. "Thomas, what if they come looking for him? What if they think we killed him?" It was a possibility that had occurred to Thomas as well. Apache traditions regarding their fallen warriors were complex and sacred. If this man had been as important as Martha suggested, his people would certainly come seeking answers about his fate, as if summoned by their fears. A sound drifted across the desert night that made both parents freeze. It was the call of a nighthawk, but repeated in a pattern that seemed too regular, too purposeful to be natural. Thomas had heard similar sounds before, usually followed by raided homesteads and missing livestock. "Go inside," he told Sarah quietly, reaching for his rifle. "Wake Evangeline and get her dressed. We may need to leave quickly." But even as he prepared for possible danger, Thomas couldn't shake the memory of his daughter's words about the warrior's gentle touch and sad eyes. Perhaps what was coming for them wasn't vengeance, but something far more complicated and far more dangerous to their understanding of the world they'd thought they knew. In her pocket, unnoticed by everyone including herself, Evangeline carried a single eagle feather that had somehow fallen from the dying warrior's hair. The sacred feather seemed to pulse with its own warmth against the small girl's leg, as if carrying messages between worlds that adults had forgotten how to hear. Dawn revealed what the Hartwell family had feared and hoped for in equal measure. Arranged carefully on their front porch, as if placed by invisible hands during the night, lay a collection of items that took their breath away. A medicine bundle wrapped in soft deerskin sat beside a pair of small moccasins that would fit Evangeline perfectly. Strings of turquoise and silver beads caught the early morning light, their craftsmanship so exquisite that Sarah gasped when she saw them. Most striking of all was an ear of corn, painted with sacred symbols and tied with ribbons in the 4 traditional Apache colors representing the directions. Thomas approached these gifts with his rifle ready, scanning the horizon for signs of the people who must have placed them there. But the desert appeared empty, showing no evidence of the visitors who had crept so close to their home under cover of darkness. Only the gifts themselves proved that Apache eyes had been watching their family sleep. "What does it mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the morning stillness. Before Thomas could answer, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of other settlers. Jeremiah Banks rode in first, followed by 4 men from his ranch, all armed and clearly expecting trouble. They pulled up short when they saw the display of Apache items on the Hartwell porch. "Sweet Jesus," Banks muttered, dismounting quickly. "They've marked you for death, Thomas. These are warning signs before an attack." But Martha Caldwell, arriving moments later in her small wagon, shook her grey head emphatically. She walked directly to the porch and examined each item carefully, her weathered hands hovering over them without quite touching. "No," she said firmly, "these aren't threats. Jeremiah, you're reading this all wrong." She looked up at the Hartwell family with an expression of wonder mixed with concern. "These are gifts of honor, high honor." The distinction meant nothing to Banks, whose experiences with Apaches had taught him that the only safe assumption was hostile intent. But Martha had learned different lessons during her years in the territory. Her late husband had been one of the few settlers to establish trading relationships with local Apache groups, and she'd absorbed enough of their customs to recognize ceremonial significance when she saw it. "The medicine bundle alone tells us this comes from someone important," Martha explained, gesturing toward the deerskin package. "And these moccasins, see how they're decorated? That's not everyday footwear. Those are made for ceremony, for someone being honored by the tribe." Carlos Mendoza chose that moment to arrive, his pack mules loaded with trade goods and his timing, as always, impeccable. The Mexican trader took one look at the gifts and let out a low whistle of amazement. "Senor Hartwell," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "you have been visited by very important people. These gifts, they represent acceptance into the Apache family. Someone has adopted your daughter as sister." The words hit the gathered settlers like a physical blow. Adoption into Apache society was something none of them had imagined possible for a white child. It suggested a level of honor and acceptance that challenged every assumption they held about the relationship between their peoples. Carlos knelt beside the gifts, his experienced eyes reading meanings that escaped the others. This medicine bundle, it contains sacred herbs and objects for protection. The corn represents sustenance and blessing. The moccasins mean she's welcome to walk Apache paths. He looked up at Evangeline, who had been watching quietly from her mother's side. "Little one, you must have done something very special to earn such gifts." Evangeline nodded solemnly. "I gave water to the hurt man." "See," Carlos said softly, "water is life in the desert. You gave life to one of theirs when you could have let him die. That makes you family." Banks couldn't accept such explanations. In his experience, Apaches took what they wanted by force and gave nothing in return except death and destruction. The idea that they might honor a settler child contradicted everything he believed about their nature. "It's a trick," he insisted. "They're trying to make us lower our guard before they attack. We need to gather everyone at my ranch, where we can defend ourselves properly." But other voices began joining the conversation, and not all of them agreed with Banks's interpretation. Word of the gifts had spread quickly through their scattered community, and more settlers continued arriving throughout the morning. Some came expecting to help plan defenses against imminent attack, but others came with curiosity about this unprecedented situation. Among the arrivals was Jim Morrison, an older man who'd served as an army scout before taking up ranching. He'd fought Apaches in his younger days, but had also learned to respect their customs and intelligence. When he saw the gifts, his weathered face grew thoughtful. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "In 20 years of dealing with Apache tribes, I've never heard of them honoring a white child this way. Something extraordinary must have happened." As the morning progressed, the Hartwell family found themselves at the center of a community debate that reflected deeper divisions about how to coexist with the Apache people. Banks and his supporters advocated for immediate defensive measures, assuming the gifts were precursors to attack. But a growing number of settlers began wondering if this might represent an opportunity for something different, perhaps even peace. Martha Caldwell became the strongest voice for this alternative interpretation. She'd seen too much violence over the years to dismiss any chance for peaceful resolution, and the gift's obvious ceremonial significance suggested intentions far more complex than simple warfare. "Look at this craftsmanship," she said, holding up the beaded necklace for everyone to see. "This took days to make, weeks maybe. You don't spend that kind of time and effort on something meant to deceive enemies. This is real honor, real acceptance." Sarah found herself torn between her instinct to protect her daughter and her growing understanding that Evangeline had somehow accomplished something remarkable. The child showed no fear of the gifts, examining each one with the fascination she typically reserved for injured animals or interesting rocks. "Mama," Evangeline said quietly, "the feather in my pocket got warm when I touched the medicine bundle." Sarah's eyes widened. "What feather, sweetheart?" Evangeline reached into her pocket and produced the eagle feather that had somehow found its way into her possession during the encounter with the dying warrior. The sacred feather seemed to glow in the morning light, its perfect form unmarred despite her adventures. Carlos saw the feather and crossed himself reverently. "Madre de Dios," he whispered. "That is a war chief's feather. Somehow it chose to go with you." The implications hung in the desert air like heat waves, shimmering with possibilities that none of them fully understood. Evangeline's simple act of mercy had set forces in motion that went far beyond ordinary human relationships, touching something deeper in the spiritual traditions that governed Apache life. As the debate continued around them, the gifts remained on their porch like silent ambassadors from a world most settlers never bothered to understand. But understanding, it seemed, was now essential for everyone's survival. 3 days had passed since the gifts appeared on the Hartwell porch, and the desert had begun showing signs that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. Thomas noticed them first, subtle disturbances in the normal patterns of wildlife movement, tracks that appeared and disappeared like whispers in the sand, and most telling of all, the complete absence of Apache sign where it had been commonplace before. "They're out there," he told Sarah, as they watched the sunrise paint the eastern mountains. "But they're waiting for something. The waiting had frayed everyone's nerves to breaking points. Half the settler community had gathered at Jeremiah Banks's fortified ranch, turning it into an armed camp where men took turns standing watch and women kept children close. The other half had chosen to remain on their own properties, either from stubborn independence or growing belief that the Apache intentions might not be hostile. Martha Caldwell had become the unofficial spokesperson for this second group, using her trading post as a meeting place for those who thought violence might not be inevitable. Her calm assessment of the situation had influenced several families to resist Banks's calls for preemptive strikes against Apache camps. We're talking about starting a war, she'd argued in their latest community meeting. Based on what? Gifts left on a porch and a child's act of kindness. That seems like poor reasoning for getting people killed, but Banks remained unconvinced. His experience had taught him that Apache generosity was always followed by Apache demands, and those demands usually involved things no civilized person should have to give. The fact that they were focusing their attention on a 6-year-old child struck him as particularly ominous. Carlos Mendoza had been staying longer than usual on this trading circuit, sensing that his cultural knowledge might prove essential in the coming days. He'd spent hours with the Hartwell family, explaining Apache customs and trying to help them understand the spiritual significance of what had transpired. The man your daughter helped, Stone Bear, was his name among his people. Carlos explained during one of these sessions. He was not just any warrior, but nephew to Chief Red Cloud himself. A war leader, yes, but also a healer and vision seeker. His death would have been mourned throughout Apache territory. The revelation that Evangeline had aided someone so important explained the magnitude of the gifts, but it also raised the stakes considerably. If Stone Bear had died, his family and clan would be obligated to seek justice or revenge. If he lived, the debt of honor would be equally binding, but might take very different forms. Is he alive? Thomas asked the question that had haunted him since learning the warrior's identity. Carlos spread his hands in the universal gesture of uncertainty. The gifts suggest he survived long enough to tell his story. But whether he lives still, only the spirits know. Evangeline had been experiencing strange dreams since the night the gifts appeared. She would wake with fragments of visions that seemed more real than ordinary dreams. Images of Apache ceremonies, understanding of words in a language she'd never learned, and most disturbing to her parents, a sense of being called towards something beyond their small homestead. I dreamed about the man again, she told her mother one morning, her blue eyes bright with memory. He was sitting by a fire, and he looked healthy. He kept saying something that sounded like little sister, but in his words, not ours. Sarah felt a chill, despite the morning warmth. Her daughter's dreams had always been vivid, but these seemed different, more like communications than simple childhood fantasies. The idea that Apache spiritual practices might somehow be reaching across the desert to touch her child terrified her in ways she couldn't fully express. On the fourth morning, after the gifts appeared, the situation changed dramatically. Thomas was checking their water supply when he spotted movement on the ridge that overlooked their small valley. A single Apache warrior sat motionless on horseback, positioned where he could observe their homestead without presenting a threat. He wore no war paint and carried a staff with white cloth attached, the universal symbol of peaceful intentions. Within an hour, similar figures had appeared on other ridgelines throughout the area. Not threatening, not advancing, but unmistakably present. The message was clear. They were being watched, and their watchers wanted that fact to be known. The appearance of Apache scouts sent immediate waves of panic through the settler community. Banks organized armed patrols and sent riders to Fort Apache requesting military intervention. But the scouts made no aggressive moves, maintaining their distant vigil without interfering with normal settler activities. Martha Caldwell rode out to the Hartwell homestead to see the situation firsthand. She brought with her a wooden staff that her late husband had carved years earlier, a talking stick he'd been given during peaceful negotiations with Apache leaders. The carved staff was decorated with symbols from both cultures, representing the possibility of understanding between different peoples. "I think they want to talk," she told Thomas, gesturing toward the distant figures. In Apache custom, this kind of display usually precedes formal negotiations. Carlos arrived shortly after Martha, his pack mules loaded not with trade goods, but with items that suggested more serious purposes. Among his supplies were ceremonial objects and gifts appropriate for diplomatic meetings. Things he'd acquired over years of building relationships throughout the territory. "They have chosen you," he told the Hartwell family directly. Stonebear's vision during his near-death experience must have been powerful indeed. "He saw something in your daughter that convinced him she was sent by the spirits." Evangeline listened to these adult conversations with the serious attention she gave to anything she didn't fully understand. The eagle feather in her pocket had grown warm again, and she found herself drawn to look toward the ridgelines where the Apache scouts maintained their patient vigil. "They're not scary," she announced suddenly, interrupting the adults' discussion. "They're just watching to make sure I'm safe." Her certainty unsettled everyone present, but it also carried a conviction that was hard to dismiss. The child who had shown mercy to a dying warrior now seemed to possess insights into Apache intentions that escaped her elders entirely. That evening, as the sun set behind the western mountains, something new appeared near their homestead. A single object had been placed on a flat rock about 50 yards from their front porch, close enough to be clearly visible, but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening. Through Thomas's spyglass, they could see it was another ceremonial staff, similar to Martha's talking stick, but decorated with specific symbols that Carlos recognized as formal invitation markers. "Tomorrow," Carlos said quietly, "they will come to talk." The night before the promised Apache visit brought little sleep to anyone in the scattered settler community. At the Banks Ranch, men cleaned weapons and checked ammunition supplies, while their wives tried to keep children calm, despite the adults' obvious tension. But at the Hartwell homestead, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Carlos Mendoza had spent the evening educating the family about proper protocols for Apache diplomatic meetings. Such encounters followed ancient traditions that could mean the difference between peace and war, and ignorance of the customs might be interpreted as disrespect or hostility. "When they come," Carlos explained, "they will approach slowly and announce themselves from a distance. You must wait for them to speak first. And Thomas, you should stand with your family, but not step forward until invited. Evangeline," he looked at the little girl seriously, "you are the reason for this meeting. When they call for you, go without fear. But remember that you represent not just your family, but all the settler people." Sarah's maternal instincts rebelled against the idea of her 6-year-old daughter playing such a crucial role in negotiations that could determine everyone's fate. But the spiritual dimensions of the situation had moved beyond ordinary parental concerns into territory where different rules applied. "What if she says something wrong?" Sarah asked. Voicing her deepest fear, Carlos shook his head gently. "She cannot say anything wrong. Children speak with the voice of truth, and the Apache know this." Stonebear's vision showed him a child who would bridge our peoples. They trust in that vision more than they trust in adult words. Evangeline herself seemed remarkably calm about the approaching meeting. She'd spent much of the evening sitting quietly on their porch, the eagle feather in her small hands, as if listening to voices only she could hear. When her parents finally convinced her to come inside for supper, she looked at them with eyes that seemed older than her years. "I know what I'm supposed to say," she announced matter-of-factly. "The feather tells me." Thomas exchanged worried glances with Sarah. Their daughter's growing connection to Apache spiritual traditions unsettled them both, but they could hardly deny the evidence of supernatural involvement in recent events. The gifts, the dreams, the perfect timing of everything that had transpired, it all pointed toward forces beyond ordinary human understanding. Dawn came with unusual silence across the desert. Even the normal sounds of birds and small animals seemed muted, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. Thomas stood on their porch with his family, watching the eastern horizon, where the first Apache figures would appear. They didn't have to wait long. As the sun cleared the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, a small procession became visible, moving slowly down the main canyon path. 3 riders approached at a respectful walking pace, allowing plenty of time for the settlers to observe their peaceful intentions. The lead rider carried a staff decorated with white eagle feathers, the symbol of truce and sacred purpose. Behind him rode 2 other Apache men, one elderly with gray braids and dignified bearing, the other younger, but wearing the distinctive paint and ornaments that marked him as a war chief. But it was the lead rider who commanded attention. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that this man possessed the natural authority that came from years of leadership and the respect of his people. This would be Chief Red Cloud himself, coming to meet with a settler family as if they were equals, deserving of his personal attention. The procession stopped about 30 yards from the Hartwell cabin, and Chief Red Cloud dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, his weathered face bearing the marks of wisdom earned through decades of guiding his people through impossible circumstances. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the morning air. "I am Red Cloud of the Apache people. I come seeking the child who gave water to my nephew Stone Bear, who lies between life and death because of wounds received while protecting Apache children from Mexican slavers." The words hit the settlers like physical blows. Stone Bear hadn't been raiding their community. He'd been defending Apache children from slave raiders, a threat that plagued both Apache and Mexican communities along the border. The arrows that had wounded him hadn't come from settler weapons, but from the guns of men who trafficked in human misery. "I am Thomas Hartwell," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "This is my wife Sarah and our daughter Evangeline. She is the child you seek." Red Cloud's gaze fixed on Evangeline, and his stern expression softened slightly. The little girl stood between her parents, showing no fear despite the momentous nature of the encounter. In her small hands, she held the eagle feather that had somehow chosen to accompany her from that fateful day in the canyon. "Come forward, little sister," Red Cloud said, using words that Evangeline somehow understood despite never having learned Apache language. "Let me see the one who honored my nephew with the gift of life." Evangeline walked forward without hesitation, her bare feet making small sounds in the desert sand. When she reached the Apache chief, she held out the eagle feather with both hands, offering it back to its people. Red Cloud stared at the feather for a long moment, then looked into Evangeline's eyes with an intensity that seemed to peer into her soul. What he saw there must have confirmed whatever Stone Bear had told him, because he nodded slowly and accepted the feather with reverence. "Stone Bear spoke truly," he said, his voice carrying across the desert to where other settlers had begun gathering to witness this historic encounter. "The spirits sent you to save him so that he might carry a message to our people." He saw in his death vision that peace between our peoples is possible, but only if both sides choose wisdom over fear. The old man behind Red Cloud dismounted and approached carrying a large painted shield. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that the shield was covered with intricate symbols and designs that told stories of battles and victories. But at its center was a new addition, a small figure of a blonde girl offering water to a fallen warrior. "This is Stone Bear's war shield," Red Cloud explained. "He has painted upon it the vision that saved his life and showed him the path to peace. You, little sister, are part of his medicine now, part of the sacred story that guides our people." The implications of this revelation rippled through the gathering crowd of settlers. Evangeline had become more than just a kind child who'd helped a wounded man. She'd become a spiritual symbol that might reshape the relationship between two peoples who'd known only conflict for generations. But not everyone present was prepared to accept such possibilities. The tension of the morning's diplomatic encounter was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Jeremiah Banks rode hard toward the gathering, followed by 6 armed men from his ranch, their weapons clearly visible and their intentions unmistakably hostile. The Apache warriors tensed but held their positions, respecting the sacred nature of the truce, even as Banks destroyed its peaceful atmosphere. "Thomas, get away from them!" Banks shouted, reining his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. This is exactly what they wanted, to get us all in one place, where they can slaughter us. Red Cloud's expression remained calm, but his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the war club at his belt. The other Apache warriors similarly prepared for violence while maintaining their diplomatic postures. The entire encounter balanced on a knife's edge between peace and bloodshed. But before anyone could escalate the confrontation further, Carlos Mendoza came racing down the canyon path on his fastest mule, waving a leather document case above his head like a banner. His usually composed demeanor had given way to urgent excitement as he shouted words that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Esperen!" "Wait, I have found something that changes everything." Carlos's arrival provided a crucial moment for tempers to cool and attention to shift toward whatever news had driven him to such urgency. He dismounted quickly and approached the mixed group of Apache and settlers with obvious excitement mixed with apprehension. "Last night, I could not sleep for thinking about this meeting," Carlos explained, breathing heavily from his rapid ride. "So I went to explore the old Spanish mission ruins in Cañon de los Muertos. My grandfather once told me that important documents were hidden there during the Apache wars of the last century." He opened his leather case and withdrew a rolled document that appeared ancient, its parchment yellowed with age and sealed with what remained of official wax stamps. The writing visible on its surface was in Spanish, but the formal layout suggested legal importance. "This is a treaty," Carlos announced, his voice carrying across the desert morning. "Signed in 1821 between the Spanish colonial government and the Apache Confederation, led by Chief Victorio, Red Cloud's grandfather. It grants the Apache people perpetual rights to all lands within a 50-mile radius of the sacred canyon where Stone Bear was found." The implications hit both groups simultaneously. If the document was authentic, it meant that every settler homestead in their area, including the Hartwell property, was built on land that legally belonged to the Apache people. The Spanish had signed away territorial rights that they'd never actually possessed, and the American territorial government had later sold those same lands to settlers without any legal authority to do so. Red Cloud stepped forward to examine the treaty, his weathered fingers tracing the Spanish words with surprising familiarity. Many Apache leaders of his generation had learned to read both Spanish and English as tools of survival in dealing with various colonial powers. "This speaks truly," he confirmed after several minutes of careful study. "My grandfather's mark is here, and the description of the boundaries matches what we have always claimed as our traditional territory." Thomas felt his world shifting beneath his feet. Everything he'd built, every sacrifice his family had made, every drop of sweat and blood invested in their homestead, all of it rested on a foundation of legal lies and broken promises. The land that the American territorial government had sold them had never been America's to sell. "That doesn't matter," Banks declared, his voice harsh with determination. "Spanish treaties don't mean anything now. This is American territory, and we've made it productive with our own hands. No court in the territory is going to side with Apaches over American citizens." But Martha Caldwell, who had remained silent during the morning's dramatic developments, stepped forward with an expression of deep sadness and dawning understanding. She'd lived in the territory longer than most, and she'd heard rumors and stories that suddenly made terrible sense. "Jeremiah, you're wrong," she said quietly. "International law recognizes prior treaties, especially those involving indigenous peoples and colonial powers. And more than that," she gestured toward the Apache warriors, "they've never stopped being the rightful owners of this land. We've been living here by their tolerance, not by right. The legal revelation recontextualized everything that had happened between the Apache and settler communities. What settlers had interpreted as raids and attacks might have been attempts to reclaim stolen property. What they'd seen as Apache aggression might have been defensive actions by a people protecting their ancestral homeland. Red Cloud spoke into the stunned silence that followed Martha's words. For 50 years, my people have watched yours build homes and raise families on land that was never yours to claim. We could have driven you away at any time. Our warriors outnumber your settlers by many hundreds. But we chose to let you stay because we hoped you might learn to share what the spirits gave to all people. Evangeline, who had been listening to these adult revelations with the serious attention she gave to everything she didn't fully understand, stepped forward with the directness that only children possess. "If it's your land," she said to Red Cloud, "then why did you let us stay? And why did the hurt man, Stone Bear, why did he want me to help him if we were living where we shouldn't be?" Red Cloud's stern expression softened as he looked down at the child, whose simple act had precipitated this moment of truth. Her questions cut through the legal and political complexities to reach the spiritual heart of the matter. Because, little sister, the spirits showed Stone Bear that some of your people have hearts that can learn to see beyond fear and hatred. When you gave him water, you proved that the prophecy spoken by our medicine men might be fulfilled. Carlos cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the document in his hands. "There is more," he said carefully. "This treaty includes specific provisions for what the Spanish called peaceful coexistence between Apache people and any future settlers. It establishes protocols for sharing resources and settling disputes without warfare. The treaty's provisions offered a potential pathway forward that neither violence nor abandonment could provide. But implementing such arrangements would require both communities to abandon long-held assumptions about ownership, justice, and the right to determine their own destinies." Thomas struggled with the implications as both a man of faith and a practical frontier settler. His Christian beliefs taught him to respect the rights of others and to acknowledge past wrongs. But his investment in their homestead represented years of back-breaking labor and everything his family owned. "What are you asking of us?" he said to Red Cloud directly. The Apache chief was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the ancient treaty to the child who had started this entire sequence of events, then to the gathered settlers and his own warriors. His next words would determine whether this revelation led to justice and peace or to renewed conflict. "I ask nothing," Red Cloud finally replied. Stone Bear's vision showed him that the choice must be freely made by those with courage to choose correctly. "The spirits have provided a way forward, but only if both our peoples are willing to walk it together." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the desert's brief coolness and replacing it with the heat that would soon make extended outdoor meetings impossible. But no one moved to seek shade. The weight of history and the possibility of a different future held everyone transfixed, waiting to see if ancient wisdom could triumph over modern fears. The revelation of the Spanish treaty had created a moment of stunned silence that stretched across the desert morning like the pause before thunder. But the implications of that ancient document were too massive, too life-changing for anyone to process quickly. Red Cloud's challenge, that both peoples must choose to walk forward together, hung in the increasingly hot air like a question that would define generations. Thomas Hartwell found himself at the center of a decision that went far beyond his individual family's welfare. As the father of the child who had bridged two worlds, his response would carry symbolic weight that could influence every settler family in the territory. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like the desert sun itself. "I need time to think," Thomas said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "This changes everything we believed about our rights to be here. I need to discuss it with my wife, and our community needs to understand what this means." Red Cloud nodded with the patience of someone who had learned that important decisions could not be rushed. We will return to our camp and wait. But know this, other Apache clans are watching what happens here. Stone Bear's vision has spread among our people like wildfire across dry grass. They believe the spirits have finally provided a path to peace. But only if the heart wisdom of a small child can overcome the fear wisdom of adults. The Apache delegation departed as ceremoniously as they had arrived, but their parting left behind more than just hoofprints in the sand. They had fundamentally altered the moral landscape that every settler would now have to navigate. The comfortable certainty of righteous ownership had been replaced by the uncomfortable complexity of historical justice. Banks and his supporters retreated to their armed encampment, but their numbers had been visibly shaken by the morning's revelations. Several men who had ridden with him now hung back, their expressions troubled by implications they couldn't dismiss as easily as they might have preferred. The discovery of the Spanish treaty had introduced legal and moral questions that pure force could not resolve. Martha Caldwell lingered after the others had departed, her weathered face showing the internal struggle of someone wrestling with decades of assumptions about land, law, and right. She'd lived through enough frontier hardships to understand the practical difficulties of the choice they all faced. But she'd also lived long enough to recognize historical justice when it stared her in the face. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about something my late husband once told me. He said the Apache never really understood our concept of land ownership because they saw the earth as something that belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. Maybe this is our chance to learn what they were trying to teach us all along." Carlos Mendoza had remained behind as well, his usual trader's pragmatism replaced by something approaching spiritual awe at the documents he'd discovered. The ancient treaty represented more than legal precedent. It offered proof that peaceful coexistence had been envisioned and planned by wiser people than those currently. Grappling with its implications, there is something else in these documents, Carlos said, spreading additional papers from his leather case on the Hartwell's porch table. Detailed maps showing not just territorial boundaries, but specific sites that were designated as neutral ground, places where both peoples could meet, trade, and resolve disputes without violence. The maps revealed a sophisticated system of mutual coexistence that the Spanish and Apache had developed over decades of practical experience. Sacred sites were protected for Apache spiritual practices, while other areas were designated for agricultural development that both peoples could benefit from. Water rights were carefully allocated based on seasonal needs rather than permanent ownership. It's like they were creating a completely different way of living together, Sarah observed, studying the intricate details of the territorial agreements. Not just tolerance, but actual cooperation. Evangeline, who had been quietly examining Stone Bear's painted shield while the adults discussed legal implications, looked up with the clarity that sometimes came to children who hadn't yet learned that certain things were supposed to be impossible. "Why don't we just do what the old papers say?" she asked. "If it worked before, why wouldn't it work now?" Her question highlighted the central challenge that all the adults were struggling to articulate. The historical precedent existed, the legal framework was documented, and the spiritual imperative had been provided through Stone Bear's vision. The only missing element was the collective, courage to choose cooperation over conflict. But choosing cooperation would require settlers to acknowledge that their fundamental assumptions about territorial rights had been wrong from the beginning. It would mean accepting Apache partnership rather than asserting American dominance. It would require sharing rather than claiming, and trust rather than fear. Thomas spent the afternoon walking the boundaries of his property, seeing it with new eyes now that he understood its true legal status. Every fence post he'd planted, every irrigation ditch he'd dug, every improvement he'd made to the land, all of it had been built on Apache territory, with Apache tolerance rather than American authority. The realization should have been devastating, but instead he found himself feeling something unexpected: relief. The constant tension of living in supposed enemy territory, the fear that had shadowed every day since they'd arrived, the moral complexity of displacing indigenous peoples, all of that could potentially be resolved through honest acknowledgement of the truth. Sarah joined him at sunset, their daughter between them as they watched the sun disappear behind the western mountains. The desert evening brought its brief respite from the day's heat, and with it a sense of possibility that hadn't existed in the morning. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft in the cooling air. "I'm thinking about what kind of world we want to leave for Evangeline," Thomas replied. "We can continue living with the fear and violence that brought us here, or we can choose something different, something better." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their family moment, but these were expected visitors. Word of the day's revelations had spread throughout the settler community, and families who had been forced to choose sides were now coming to discuss their options with the people who had become unwilling leaders in this historical moment. Jim Morrison arrived first. The old scout whose experience with Apache warfare had given him unique perspective on the possibilities for peace. Behind him came 3 other families who had children, roughly Evangeline's age, people who were thinking beyond their own immediate circumstances to the kind of future they wanted for the next generation. "Thomas," Morrison said without preamble, "I've been thinking about that treaty all day. I've fought Apaches for 15 years, and I can tell you that they could have driven us out any time they chose to. The fact that they didn't, that they've been waiting for us to understand something we were too stubborn to see, that changes everything." The evening discussion that followed became an impromptu community meeting as more settlers arrived to grapple with the implications of the Spanish treaty. Some came with genuine desire to explore possibilities for peaceful coexistence, others with skepticism about Apache intentions, and still others with fear about what acknowledging the truth might cost them. But gradually, as the desert night settled around them and stars began appearing in the clear sky, a consensus began emerging among the gathered families. The discovery of the treaty had provided them with something none of them had expected to find: a legitimate path forward that honored both the rights of indigenous peoples and the investments that settlers had made in good faith. Martha Caldwell articulated what many of them were beginning to feel. "We have a choice," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We can continue pretending that might makes right, or we can choose to be the generation that finally gets this relationship correct." Carlos added practical considerations that gave weight to their idealistic discussions. "The Apache Confederation includes more than 2,000 warriors across multiple clans. Red Cloud's band is just one group among many. If we can establish peaceful relationships here, it could prevent conflicts that would otherwise be inevitable." As the evening progressed and more families committed to exploring the treaty's provisions, Thomas began to sense that they were approaching a moment of historical significance. The choice they made in the coming days would determine not just their own survival, but the kind of society their children would inherit. When the last visitors had departed and the Hartwell family prepared for bed, Evangeline approached her father with the eagle feather she'd been carrying since her encounter with Stone Bear. "Papa," she said seriously, "the feather told me something important today. It said that tomorrow everything changes forever." Dawn on the day that would change everything arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to hold the entire desert in anticipation. Thomas Hartwell had barely slept, and the circles under his eyes spoke to hours spent wrestling with the magnitude of the decision his family would help make in the coming hours. Today, representatives from both communities would meet at the sacred canyon where Evangeline had first encountered Stone Bear, and the outcome of that meeting would determine whether two peoples could learn to share the same land in peace. The morning brought unexpected visitors before. The sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains. A procession of Apache riders approached the Hartwell homestead, but this time their numbers had grown dramatically. What had been 3 representatives the day before had become nearly 20. including women and elders whose presence signaled the ceremonial importance of what was about to unfold. Leading the procession was Red Cloud, but beside him rode another figure that made Thomas's heart stop. Stone Bear himself sat upright on a painted horse, his chest bearing fresh scars, but his eyes bright with life and purpose. The Apache war chief had not merely survived his wounds, he had recovered enough to witness the fulfillment of the vision that had saved his life. Thomas Hartwell. Red Cloud called as the procession halted respectfully outside their property boundaries. "We have come to escort your family to the sacred canyon. Stone Bear wishes to complete the ceremony that his vision demanded." Sarah emerged from their cabin with Evangeline between them, all three dressed in their best clothes for what they understood might be the most important day of their lives. Evangeline carried the ceremonial items that had been gifted to her, including a sacred water bowl that Carlos had provided for the occasion. The little girl showed no fear, only the solemn concentration of someone who understood that significant things were expected of her. The journey to the sacred canyon took nearly 2 hours, winding through desert paths that few settlers had ever traveled. Along the way, they were joined by other groups, Martha Caldwell and her supporters, Carlos Mendoza with trade goods that would serve as ceremonial offerings, and even some of the more moderate settlers who had decided that curiosity outweighed fear, but not everyone had chosen to participate in the peace ceremony. Jeremiah Banks and his hardline supporters had positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the canyon, armed and ready to intervene if they perceived treachery. Their presence created a tension that threatened to undermine the sacred nature of what was about to unfold. The sacred canyon itself was unlike anything the settlers had expected. Ancient petroglyphs covered the red rock walls, telling stories that stretched back centuries before any European had set foot in the Americas. A natural spring provided water year-round, creating a small oasis where desert plants grew thick and green. The spiritual significance of the place was unmistakable, even to those who had never learned to read the signs that native peoples saw in the landscape. Stone Bear dismounted slowly, his movements still careful due to his recent injuries, but his bearing dignified and ceremonial. When he spoke, his voice carried across the canyon with surprising strength. "I call upon the spirits of this sacred place to witness what happens here today. When I lay dying in this canyon, the Great Spirit sent me a vision of peace between our peoples. That vision came in the form of a small child who shared her water with a dying enemy. Seeing past fear to the person who needed help, he gestured for Evangeline to approach, and she walked forward without hesitation. The eagle feather in her small hand seemed to catch and reflect light in ways that defied the morning shadows, and several of the Apache elders nodded in recognition of spiritual significance. "Little sister of the desert," Stone Bear continued, using the Apache name that had become Evangeline's ceremonial title. "You saved my life, not with medicine or magic, but with simple kindness. That kindness opened a door between our worlds that had been closed by generations of mistrust and fear." Red Cloud stepped forward, carrying the ancient Spanish treaty that Carlos had discovered, its parchment pages now mounted on a wooden frame that elevated it to the status of a sacred document. The formal recognition of the treaty's legitimacy would require acknowledgement from both communities. But first, it needed the spiritual blessing that only the sacred canyon could provide. "Today we choose between the path of continued conflict and the path of shared wisdom," Red Cloud announced to the gathering crowd. "The spirits have provided both the legal framework and the spiritual guidance necessary for peace. What remains is for human hearts to choose courage over fear." Thomas Hartwell stepped forward, his decision made after a night of prayer and reflection. "We acknowledge that we have been living on Apache land without permission or payment. We acknowledge that the treaties we thought gave us legal rights were based on lies and broken promises." His words carried across the canyon like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would reach far beyond the immediate gathering. Several Apache elders nodded in recognition of the courage required for such admission, while some of the settler families exchanged uncertain glances, but before the ceremony could continue, the sound of rifle fire echoed from the canyon walls. Jeremiah Banks and his followers had decided that talk of shared land and ancient treaties represented an unacceptable threat to everything they believed about American manifest destiny. No Apache is going to steal land that we've paid for with American blood. Banks shouted from his position on the ridge, his rifle aimed directly at Red Cloud's heart. The crack of Banks's rifle shot shattered the sacred stillness of the canyon like lightning splitting an ancient tree. But the bullet struck rock instead of flesh, as Red Cloud had moved with the instinctive speed of a warrior who had survived decades of conflict. Apache warriors reached for their weapons, while settler families scattered for cover behind boulders and desert brush. In that moment of chaos, when generations of mistrust threatened to explode into the violence that both sides had feared, Evangeline Hartwell did something that no adult would have had the courage to attempt. The 6-year-old girl walked directly into the space between the opposing forces, her small figure impossibly brave in the crossfire of ancient hatreds. "Stop!" she called out, her young voice somehow carrying clearly across the canyon, despite the shouting and confusion. "You're all acting like the hurt animals I find in the desert, scared and ready to bite anyone who tries to help." The unexpected intervention of a child momentarily stunned both sides into silence. Banks kept his rifle trained on the Apache leaders, but his finger hesitated on the trigger. Apache warriors held their weapons ready, but waited to see what their war chief would command. In that pregnant pause, Evangeline continued speaking with the directness that only children possess. "When I found the hurt man, Stone Bear, he was scared too. But when I gave him water, he didn't hurt me. He blessed me instead. That's what people do when you're kind to them, even if they're different from you." Stone Bear himself stepped forward, placing his body between the armed settlers and his own people. The fresh scars on his chest bore testament to how close he had come to death, but his eyes held no anger or desire for revenge. "Brothers," he said, addressing Banks and his followers in heavily accented but clear English, "this child speaks with the wisdom of the spirits. She sees what we have forgotten in our fear, that we are all people trying to protect what we love." Martha Caldwell emerged from behind the boulder where she had taken cover, her weathered hands visibly shaking, but her voice steady. "Jeremiah, put down that gun. You're pointing it at people who came here to talk peace, not make war. They want to take our land." Banks shouted back, though his rifle wavered slightly. "Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, they want to steal it all." Red Cloud stepped beside Stone Bear, both Apache leaders now exposed to Banks's weapon, but showing no fear. When the chief spoke, his words carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the survival of his people. "We do not want to take what you have built," Red Cloud said firmly. "The treaty our peoples discovered speaks of sharing, not stealing. Your families can keep your homes, your fields, your cattle. We ask only that you acknowledge this is Apache land, and that we share it as partners, not as enemies." Carlos Mendoza, who had been examining the ancient treaty documents throughout the confrontation, held up the parchment pages so that everyone could see them. "The Spanish treaty is very specific about this," he called out. "It established protocols for joint use of the land, not displacement of either people. The legal framework that the treaty provided offered a path forward that neither complete surrender nor total victory could match. But implementing such arrangements would require both communities to abandon the zero-sum thinking that had driven frontier conflicts for generations." Thomas Hartwell made his own choice in that moment, walking to stand beside his daughter in the space between the two armed groups. "Jeremiah, she's right. We came here talking about Christian values and American justice, but we've been living on stolen land and calling it righteousness. Maybe it's time we actually practiced what we've been preaching." One by one, other settler families began emerging from cover to stand with the Hartwells. Martha Caldwell was first, followed by Jim Morrison and the other families who had children to think about. Their numbers grew slowly but steadily as people chose courage over fear, hope over hatred. Banks found himself increasingly isolated as his support melted away. The rifle in his hands, which had seemed like the tool of righteous defense just minutes before, now felt heavy with the weight of choices that could destroy any chance for peace. "You're all fools," he said bitterly, but he lowered his weapon. "This will end in disaster, mark my words." With the immediate threat of violence diffused, Stone Bear approached the sacred spring that bubbled from the canyon rocks. He withdrew a ceremonial bowl, carved from wood and decorated with symbols from both Apache and Spanish traditions, and filled it with the clear, cool water that had sustained life in this place for countless generations. "Now," he said solemnly, "we complete the ceremony that the spirits demanded. The water that saved my life will seal the peace between our peoples." Evangeline was the first to drink from the bowl, her small sip watched by dozens of adults who understood they were witnessing history. The water passed from Apache to settler and back again, each person drinking from the same source that had sustained both peoples in the harsh desert. 20 years had passed since that transformative morning in the sacred canyon, and the Arizona Territory had become something that none of the original participants could have imagined. The small settlement that had once lived in fear of Apache raids had grown into a thriving community, where Apache and settler children played together in dusty streets, where Spanish, English, and Apache languages mingled in the marketplace, and where the annual water ceremony drew visitors from across the Southwest. Evangeline Hartwell, now Evangeline Morrison, after her marriage to Jim Morrison's eldest son, stood with her own 6-year-old daughter at the memorial stone that marked the site where peace had been achieved. The carved granite monument bore inscriptions in 3 languages, telling the story of how a child's simple act of kindness had reshaped the relationship between peoples who had known only conflict for generations. "Tell me again about the hurt man." "Mama?" little Sarah Morrison asked, her blue eyes bright with the same curiosity that had once driven her mother into the desert canyons. Evangeline smiled, running her fingers along the smooth stone that had been quarried from the same red rock where she had first encountered Stone Bear. The monument had been erected 5 years after the peace treaty, paid for by contributions from both Apache and settler families who wanted future generations to remember how their world had changed. "Well," Evangeline began, settling into the familiar rhythm of a story she had told countless times. "It was a very hot day, and I was chasing our chicken Henrietta, who had gotten loose again." The story had become legend in their community, told and retold until it had taken on the quality of myth. But Evangeline always tried to keep it simple and true to what she remembered. Of that morning when she was 6 years old and the world seemed much smaller than it actually was. The settlement around them bore little resemblance to the scattered, fearful homesteads of 2 decades before. Adobe buildings in the Mexican style stood alongside log cabins in the American tradition and traditional Apache shelters adapted for permanent residence. The architecture itself told the story of cultural blending that had emerged from that day in the canyon. Stone Bear, now in his 60s but still vigorous, served as the unofficial Apache ambassador to the territorial government. His war chief status had been transformed into something like mayor or mediator, helping to resolve disputes and negotiate agreements that affected both communities. The scars on his chest from the arrows that had nearly killed him remained visible, but they had become marks of honor rather than symbols of conflict. Red Cloud had passed away 3 years earlier, but not before seeing his vision of peaceful coexistence fully realized. His funeral had been attended by hundreds of people from both communities, and his burial site in the sacred canyon had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how enemies could become partners. Thomas and Sarah Hartwell had prospered beyond their original dreams, but not in ways they had expected when they first traveled west. Their small homestead had become the center of a cooperative farming enterprise that combined Apache knowledge of desert agriculture with settler techniques for crop cultivation. The result was productivity that neither community could have achieved alone, More importantly, their daughter's bridge building between cultures had opened possibilities that neither side had previously imagined. Apache teenagers now attended the school that Sarah had helped establish, while settler children learned traditional crafts and survival skills from Apache elders. Intermarriage had become common enough to create a generation of young people who moved fluidly between both worlds. The annual water ceremony that commemorated the original peace agreement had grown from a simple community gathering into a regional celebration that attracted visitors from Mexico, California, and the Eastern Territories. Government officials came to study their cooperative model, which had prevented the Indian wars that plagued other parts of the Southwest. But for Evangeline, the most meaningful changes were personal ones. Her own children were growing up in a world where cultural diversity was normal rather than threatening, where cooperation was expected rather than miraculous, where the idea of sharing resources seemed natural rather than revolutionary. The important thing to remember, she told her daughter as they prepared to leave the memorial site, is that it all started with something very simple. When someone needs help, you help them. It doesn't matter if they look different or speak different words. What matters is that they're a person, just like you. Little Sarah nodded solemnly, absorbing lessons that seemed obvious to her generation, but had required tremendous courage for their grandparents to learn. The child carried in her small hands an eagle feather, not the original one that had accompanied her mother's adventure, but one of its offspring, blessed in ceremony and passed down as a family treasure. As they walked back toward town, they could see the results of that long-ago act of kindness everywhere they looked. Apache and settler families worked together in the fields, their children running between them with the easy familiarity of neighbors rather than strangers. The fear that had once defined frontier life had been replaced by something that their ancestors would have considered impossible, a genuinely integrated community built on mutual respect and shared prosperity. Martha Caldwell, now in her 70s but still sharp as a desert thorn, waved to them from her expanded trading post. Carlos Mendoza's sons continued their father's business, but their trade routes now included peaceful exchanges that would have been unthinkable in the old days of constant warfare. As the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of rose and gold that Evangeline still found breathtaking after all these years, she reflected on how one small decision made by a frightened 6-year-old had created ripples that continued spreading decades later. Sometimes, she thought, the most important changes in history came not from great battles or political treaties, but from individual moments when people chose compassion over fear, kindness over suspicion, hope over hatred. Her daughter would grow up in a world where such choices seemed natural, but Evangeline would never forget how miraculous they had seemed when she first made them in a desert canyon, offering water to a dying stranger who became the key to peace.